Good morning, everyone. We have Councillor Flynn, Bach, and Braden.
Hey, Lydia.
Or Braden, Flynn, Bach, according to order. Okay. Let's see. Just pulling up my opening remarks and we'll get started. Okay. Rick, Tim, Anna, and Katie. Katie, Rick, and Tim are all here from D&D.
Hello.
Hello. All right. So we'll just go ahead. Everyone's here then, it looks like. I mean, I'll save other colleagues sign on, but these are what I can tell, non-controversial rants, but we'll see.
Jim Green may be joining us as well.
Jim Green. Okay.
Yeah, that's it for us then.
Should I wait for Jim or?
No, he's just here for questions. So I think we can probably start. Yep.
Okay, then. Very well then. Good morning, everyone. For the record, my name is Lydia Edwards. I'm chair of the Boston City Council Committee on Housing and Community Development. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Councillor Braden, Councillor Flynn, and Councillor Bach. I wanted to remind you that this is a public hearing. It is being recorded and will be rebroadcasted on Comcast 8, RCN 82, and Verizon 1964 at a later date. It is currently being streamed at boston.gov/city-council-tv. We will also take public testimony at the end of the hearing. If you are interested in testifying, please email ron.cobb, C-O-B-B, at boston.gov for the link and follow along on the live stream to know when it's your turn to speak. Please state your name, affiliation, residence, and limit your comments to a few minutes, please. Today's hearing is on docket 0817, order for hearing regarding the City of Boston to accept and expend FY20 Emergency Solutions Grant COVID-19 supplement funds awarded by the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. I am going to now introduce some of our speakers from the administration. Excuse me, I apologize. I'll allow my colleagues to have some brief opening remarks. Then we will allow for the administration to introduce themselves, and then we will continue on with the hearing. Without further ado, I'm sorry, we've also been joined by Councillor Sabi George, but in order of arrival, we'll start with Councillor Braden. Councillor Braden.
Good morning, Councillor Edwards. I'm in a different location this morning. I'm slightly discombobulated. Just interested to hear how the administration plan on spending these funds, and interested in hearing more. Thank you.
Councillor Flynn. Can people hear me? Councillor Flynn? Okay.
Hi, Councilor Edwards. I wasn't sure if you called on me.
Yeah, Councillor Flynn.
Okay. I don't have any opening statement. Thank you, Councilor Edwards.
Councillor Bach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just want to thank D&D for joining us today, and also looking forward to hearing how the administration is planning to use these funds. Obviously, we know that housing is a really critical part of the COVID-19 emergency, and I'm always interested in sort of the various buckets of funds that we get from HUD now and in ordinary times, and kind of understanding how we're using our discretion as a city within the parameters that they apply. So thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And Councillor Sabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the administration and D&D who is here with us this morning. Looking forward to the rest of the hearing. That's it for me.
Thank you, Councillor. So I'll just go ahead and turn it over to administration. We're joined here today by Tim Davis, Rick Wilson, and Jim Green, and Katie Cahill. Katie Cahill Holloway from DND. So if I will let you guys take it away.
Thank you, Chairperson Edwards, Councillor Bach, Councillor Braden, Councillor Sabi George, and Councillor Flynn. Thank you for having us here today. For the record, I am Tim Davis, Deputy Director for Policy Development and Research at the Department of Neighborhood Development. I am joined by my fellow DND staff, Rick Wilson, Katie Cahill Holloway, and Jim Green. The Federal Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act, signed on March 27th, made direct allocations to the City of Boston through 3 grant programs: the Community Development Block Grant, the Emergency Solutions Grant, or ESG, and Housing Options for Persons with AIDS, or HOPWA programs. These funds, totaling $49 million, are to be used to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus pandemic. The $23,348,669, that's an exact number, in emergency shelter grant funds, this is covered by docket number 0817, will support homeless service providers in Boston to assist with responding to the COVID-19 public health crisis. Activities prioritized for funding include adding new capacity to increase the number of winter overflow temporary emergency shelter beds, emergency shelter diversion activities, and investment in rapid rehousing programs, including the creation and management of a landlord recruitment program. The city's overarching goals for this funding are to preserve life and health through investments that will help prevent the further spread of COVID-19 in homeless populations, assist those experiencing homelessness in finding safe alternatives to congregate shelter through investment in shelter diversion programming, and promote system transformation to address overcrowding through rapid exit from shelter in light of this public health crisis. Through these interventions, the city is seeking to reduce rates of unsheltered homelessness, reduce the further spread of COVID-19, and rehouse hundreds of individuals. Katie Cahill Holloway will provide more details on how we're spending the $5 million that was in our first ESG CV grant, and to explain how we'll be spending this $23 million. I'll turn it over to Katie now. Thank you. Katie? There she
Sorry,
is.
I was on mute, so of course you couldn't hear me. Good morning, counselors. For the record, my name is Katie Cahill Holloway, and I'm a Senior Development Officer in the Supportive Housing Division at the Department of Neighborhood Development. I would like to first begin by thanking Chairperson Edwards for scheduling this hearing expeditiously. I would also like to thank Chairperson Edwards and all members of the Housing and Community Development Committee for your unwavering support of D&D's work in assisting our most vulnerable citizens in obtaining and maintaining safe and affordable housing during the ongoing COVID-19 public health crisis. The item before you is a request to accept and expend $23,348,669 in Emergency Solutions Grant CV funding from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. This represents a second allocation of ESG CV funding made to the city and authorized by the CARES Act. ESG funding through the CARES Act must be used to protect against, prevent the spread of, and respond to the public health and economic impacts of COVID-19. As Tim outlined, this additional funding will continue to support our work in assisting homeless service providers and preventing the further spread of COVID-19 among people experiencing homelessness. The council has already approved the initial round of ESG CV in the amount of $5 million, and we thank you for your swift action in that regard, as it allowed us to issue a request for proposals that prioritize reimbursement requests from homeless service providers that outlaid significant costs in the initial response to COVID-19, starting in March of 2020. I will now provide the council an update on that RFP. D&D issued an RFP in early May for $5 million in ESG CV funding. The RFP also allowed proposals for FY21 projected COVID-related expenses pending funding availability. D&D closed applications on July 7th of 2020, and we received 22 proposals totaling over $15 million in requests under this procurement. In an effort to better coordinate investments, D&D partnered with the state's Department of Housing and Community Development, the Commonwealth's ESG CV grantee, to review proposals from Boston providers. This unprecedented level of collaboration led to strategic investments and cost sharing between the city and state on proposals from Boston providers. The cost sharing arrangement largely resulted in the city covering retroactive expenditures for FY20 from March through June, and DHCD covering prospective COVID mitigation costs for FY21. Please note that the agencies that manage Boston's largest individual shelters, Pine Street Inn and the Boston Public Health Commission, submitted applications under this RFP and are in the process of applying to FEMA for eligible expenses related to the emergent response to COVID-19. The city will consider funding those proposals as needed after the FEMA contribution is determined. In addition to collaborating with DHCD, the review team made recommendations to utilize other available funding sources, such as the Boston Resiliency Fund. I'll now provide a summary of the disposition of applications received under round 1. 8 applications were jointly funded by DND and DHCD. 3 applications were funded only by DND. 4 applications were redirected to the Boston Resiliency Fund. 5 applications were declined or not prioritized under round 1, and 4 of the applications were redirected to FEMA. Several proposals, including 2 from agencies new to HUD homeless assistance funding, will be considered for round 2 ESG CV funding based on the prioritization of rapid rehousing in this round. And the new agencies will be provided with HUD-funded technical assistance that orients them to the HUD homeless assistance landscape and requirements. The intention is to support agencies that have not historically received this funding to ensure equitable distribution of these resources and to more effectively serve marginalized and underserved communities. Agencies received funding under round 1 ESG awards include the following: 9 family shelter agencies, 1 agency that serves youth and young adults experiencing homelessness, a victim service provider that serves survivors of domestic violence, 1 veteran sheltering agency, and 1 agency that serves homeless and at-risk elders. Please note that round 1 is not fully allocated pending potential awards after FEMA funding is accounted for. To date, $2,229,752 has been awarded to providers under round 1. Round 2, the accept and expend request before you today, is currently advertised for responses pending your approval. The goal of round 2 is to protect life during COVID-19 as we move into the colder winter months. We are seeking proposals to create up to 170 winter overflow beds in compliance with public health recommendations. Due to COVID-19, shelter capacity has been reduced to comply with social distancing guidelines, making the creation of these beds all the more critical to ensure individuals experiencing homelessness have a safe place to go on cold winter nights. The RFP has allocated up to $4 million towards the creation of these winter overflow beds. Recognizing the continued need to deconcentrate shelter in response to COVID-19, we are also prioritizing an unprecedented investment in rapid rehousing to rehouse hundreds of individuals and families quickly and to keep shelter occupancy at COVID safer levels. The current RFP allocates up to $14 million towards the creation of a robust rapid rehousing infrastructure, including the opportunity to set up apparatus such as a fiscal agent or administrator for rent payments, an agency to conduct housing inspections, investment in housing search and locator services, and the opportunity for homelessness and rehousing service providers to link households to the necessary services to find and maintain housing. Our third priority for this funding is scaling up diversion programming at the front door of shelter to stem inflow, building on successful models currently in place at Pine Street Inn and BPHC. Diversion involves problem solving at the front door with people presenting for shelter to see if a safe alternative to shelter is possible. The RFP allocates up to $2 million towards diversion activity. Last week, DND hosted 2 COC-wide informational sessions with a broad spectrum of community-based providers to provide an overview of the RFP and to take questions and feedback on the planned activities. In keeping with our commitment to support new providers and providers that serve underrepresented and marginalized populations, we are offering technical assistance to agencies that may require orientation to the COC and ESG. Given the critical need to operationalize winter overflow beds in advance of the cold weather, responses to the RFP are due on Friday, October 16th. We anticipate making tentative selections by November 1st. Given this timeline, we appreciate your expeditious consideration of this matter and welcome any questions you may have. And I thank you for your time.
Well, thank you. Is that it from the administration?
Yes, it is. Thank you very much.
No, thank you guys very much. I really do appreciate and was I wasn't expecting you to go through the breakdown of the $5 million, the applications thus far, and helping us to have a real understanding of how the money is moving and helping. So I really do appreciate that. I'm going to start questions from my colleagues, and I'll just go in order of arrival. So Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a quick question. The rapid rehousing program, that seems like a really essential piece of the puzzle. What are the logistics involved with that?
So rapid rehousing is an intervention, a housing intervention that is considered permanent housing, but it has a time-limited subsidy associated with it based on the household's income. So unlike something like a Section 8 that is a permanent long-term subsidy, rapid rehousing has the ability to provide financial assistance to sustain a household for up to 24 months. And paired with rapid rehousing are services to ensure that the tenancy is stable. So households might have access to things like income maximization or access to benefits, and just really learning how to sustain a tenancy. So it's not a permanent long-term subsidy, but it can be fairly robust in terms of the services and assistance it provides.
And that's good that it's a 24-month time span, because we really don't know where we're at this point, how long this emergency is going to extend.
Yes.
Thank you. That's all the questions I had, Councillor Edwards.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Flynn?
Thank you, Councilor Edwards. I may have missed a little bit of the opening statement, but I know you referenced a possible funding for a veterans center or location. Is that not official yet?
It's official. It is official. It was an award made to the New England Center and Home for Veterans, and it was for, they had proposed some space configuration changes and other mitigation strategies just to keep the veterans in that location safe. So they were awarded funds for that for FY21.
Excellent. I've been there many times. It's an excellent facility. I know the money will be well spent. The other question I had, I know you mentioned a provider for survivors of domestic violence. Can you give me a little bit of background information on that funding?
Yeah, sure. So this was a proposal from Casa Mierna, and they had a proposal to DHCD and to DND, and then also they received some funding from the Boston Resiliency Fund. The portion that DND sponsored is a piece of their rapid rehousing proposal. So what CMV has had to do, like many shelter operators, is they've had to de-densify their main location. And they've done that through leasing blocks in hotels to make sure that if people were presenting for shelter, that the main site wasn't getting overcrowded and they had someplace safe to go. And from those locations, both the auxiliary hotel rooms that they leased up in their main location, they are looking to pair survivors with rapid rehousing. And so our award to them was for that rapid rehousing funding.
That's excellent. I actually visited that location with Councilor Campbell on some of the domestic violence outreach work we were doing. So I know that will be well spent. Yeah. And just finally, what is some of the outreach that you're doing in terms of the facilities with, are you doing anything for homeless women at all? In and around the Boston area, the downtown area?
Yeah, I can speak to that a bit, and then Rick and Tim may have more to add. But I do know that D&D recently completed the renovation of a location at New Chardon Street that will be used soon, hopefully, to house 20 women experiencing homelessness with permanent supportive housing. So the building is complete. I think they're in the process of working with the shelters to identify tenants for that location. And then D&D through its COC vouchers will actually be providing basically operating subsidy to the selected provider to run that site.
Okay, is that the facility across the street from the Brook Courthouse, Edward Brook Courthouse?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions. Thank you, Councilor Edwards.
Thank you. Councilor Bach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks so much again to the D&D team for that detailed update. I did want to ask about our overall shortage of beds. I've heard the number kicking around that because of the expansion of the amount of space we need per person in our existing shelter setups, that we're sort of short about 375 beds in the city right now. And I know that you threw out the number of, I think, 175 to add. And I just was wondering if you could give us an update on kind of where this is in that landscape.
So the beds that we're procuring for now are for winter overflow beds. So it would add 170 bed capacity to the existing census. I do know that DHCD opened their second round of ESG funding, and they procured for something very similar to what we're looking to do, but they were doing it on a statewide basis. But Boston also picked up beds through that effort. I would have to get the exact number that Boston providers have been funded for, and the number of beds that will be realized through those awards. But I do know that the state was funding the main shelter providers to bring on additional bed capacity.
Okay, but you don't have a sense or Jim, maybe of kind of where we are, because it just seems to me like, there'd be the normal thing where we would try to increase for winter overflow because of the weather. And then there's the possibility that we're actually like in the hole right now anyways, which is certainly how it's been being perceived, I think, across the city, and is also what I've heard from some folks in the shelter world.
This is Tim Davis. We have been maintaining a goal of keeping shelter capacity at 80 to 90%, and our current performance is at 87% of capacity. So that's one thing we're looking at. And we've also got targets around placing homeless individuals into permanent housing and placing homeless BPS families, getting them vouchers for placing in permanent housing. Those are things that we're tracking all the time to make sure that we're kind of staying in line with our goals to recover from COVID as well as respond to it.
Okay, and
if I could add, Counselor, that one of the interesting stories that we kind of didn't get to emerge because of COVID hitting was that our shelter numbers last winter for individual adults were actually trending lower than in past years. I think the 2,500 chronically homeless people and veterans we've housed in the last 5 years was having an impact on reducing demand. And, the seasonal kind of outflow of people not going into shelters in warmer weather, especially dry, hot summer like we had this summer, notwithstanding, I think the hope is that continuing to place some chronically homeless and long-term homeless people, standing up those sites, the ComAv location, the 891 Mass Ave Hotel, where there's a sort of intensive focus on housing placements, it will be helpful in reducing demand. And then these rapid rehousing resources, we actually saw fewer people coming through the shelter system during the spring COVID surge, but we're certainly working away at trying to make sure there's a place for everyone. But as Katie also mentioned, statewide, the state put an emphasis on trying to fund other communities to throughout the state to address their own gaps rather than have everything continue to default to the city of Boston. So that's been a big advocacy point as well, as Tim and Rick know, and Katie.
Great. And can you just speak a little, or someone on the team just speak a little bit to, I know that we separately through the city budget funded an expansion of kind of our youth homelessness efforts, and that there's a significant rapid rehousing piece of that. And I'm just wondering, are we planning to piggyback on any of that with the ESG funds, or are we sort of keeping the dedicated youth population stuff because it's more flexible without HUD money in the city bailiwick and doing this separately?
So I do know that the manager that is overseeing the youth plan, they currently have an RFP out for those resources. But in our first round awards, we did make an award to Bridge for an additional, I think, 20 slots, I believe, of rapid rehousing to supplement what they're already awarded for through COC. So I think any opportunity we have to dedicate resources to that subpopulation, we're making those decisions.
And then I guess my last question is, I'm a big housing first person. I think it's super important for us to be focused on rapid rehousing and shelter that leads to permanent housing. That said, I'm very mindful of the fact that there are a number of people who live in my district who I consider unhoused constituents who are, have been long-term unhoused and for various reasons, like resist being housed. We've got a really substantial set of partners, mostly on the faith-based side downtown, who work with that community, work to make it a community. And so obviously the Boston Warm Project comes to mind as a major sort of day shelter endeavor. And I think you all know that obviously day sheltering has become even more complicated and also even more needed in this time, because so many of the the informal day shelters of libraries and cafes and other things are out of reach. And so I just wonder, as we think about all this funding, how we're thinking about that piece, because I'm very concerned about folks who are not sheltered having a place to be that's warm during the day in the winter, that's also safe from a COVID perspective, and also very concerned about public accommodation and bathroom access. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that piece, because I don't want us to completely lose sight of that in the midst of focusing as we should on permanent housing.
Maybe I'll start, Councillor. Thank you for that important question. One of the first things that we did during COVID was myself and Jerry Thomas from the Public Health Commission has reached out to the smaller providers of community meal sites and day programs in the faith community. The majority of them are downtown, but there are some in other locations like Rosie's Place, as you know. We've kept those programs in the loop. I think the public accommodation and bathroom issue is a citywide challenge that a coordinated response team of different city agencies is really looking at. It comes up time and time again. We have asked those programs. I know that Boston Warm received some supplemental funding through the Boston Resilience Fund. Amanda Grant Rose, their executive director, and I were in contact, and she was urged to look for those funds because they were very flexible. There was another grant that went to the Brazilian Workers Alliance to help these programs with intensive cleaning, so that the programs that were still having people in, so some of the faith-based programs downtown have had that support. And we will certainly make sure that all of the faith-based programs are aware of the RFP that currently exists. I know Councillor Edwards, the East Boston Soup Kitchen, that people with ties to the Soup Kitchen and the East Boston Neighborhood Health Center have participated in our Tuesday kind of meetings about street needs. So we'll keep in contact with those programs, make sure they're aware of all of the additional resources. We are looking at adding some winter capacity, including beds for women at Boston Rescue Mission, that the state is funding partly through ESG and partly through an existing winter overflow plan from prior years. But we'll stay connected. And if you're aware of any issues around unmet needs, I know there's deep concern at the St. Paul's Cathedral, Manna community, and other places about how clients are doing. One of the best things about the COVID surge, the Pine Street Outreach Team, which I want to thank the council for dedicating some additional city resources to expand, stayed connected with people on the street, have been continuing to place people and refer people, and even provide some behavioral health supports. So people have gone from the street into some of the motels and other kind of temporary facilities that were set up to deconcentrate COVID. So they've continued to do placements, and we continue to network with those providers.
Great. Well, I'm very glad to hear all that, but yeah, and I'll definitely be in touch. I think we have to be thinking about daytime indoor capacity for the winter in the same way that we're thinking about what's our maybe overflow bed need capacity. And I just worry that we're not there. And I worry, and I'll just say this, I think there's a lot of people in the city who are worried about the bathroom problem and who are talking about the bathroom problem. I just feel like we're not solving it. I'm very concerned about how we kind of confront that basic human need downtown in a speedy way. So just wanted to bring that up here. Thank you, Madam Chair. I think those are all my questions.
Thank you. We've also been joined by Councilor Mejia. Councilor Sabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to my colleagues for their thoughtful questions. And I do have a couple of quick clarifying questions on the need for additional beds, especially planning for the winter. My understanding from the conversations I've been involved in is we need 300 to 400 additional beds for winter cold weather months. So I think that's an important number to remember. And then the bathroom issue that Council Brock was just mentioning, there are some solutions on the table right now for at least the Mass and Cass area, and some pretty aggressive plans to create some opportunities for additional restrooms that I think we probably should discuss expanding those resources to the downtown area. But I also want to make sure, and I was happy that Katie mentioned it in her thorough comments and remarks, the need to make sure that this funding is also supporting our families experiencing homelessness. As we know, there are more individuals in our families experiencing homelessness than individuals. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I suppose, we don't see them and sort of witness the experience in the same way, but I am reassured to know that there's a portion of these ESG funds, the CSG funds, are going to some of our family shelter providers, because that's really important work. And down the road, we know that many of our children who are experiencing homelessness will become homeless as adults. And so that work right now is critically important. But I don't know if we could just continue for a brief moment, and then I actually will sort of ask my questions and then have to depart for another commitment. But I am curious about the 300 to 400 bed number as a need for winter weather shelter. I don't know if Jim perhaps could speak to a little bit more detail about that need this winter.
Yeah, so Councilor, what I can say is that I think that is based on prior year high, extreme cold high numbers. I think with the deconcentrated system and strategy we have now, it's not as clear that will be the winter number, but certainly the city has been reaching out repeatedly around strategies, and I think it's going to continue to be an evolving picture. We've also been pushing the state about increasing access and availability, and the Public Health Commission, received a transportation grant. We also want to look at trying to help people. One of the things we saw in the spring is people began to be motivated to reconnect with their communities of origin or places where they had some sort of fabric of, family or social support. That's certainly going to be a part of this. So there's an investment in, assessment and front door triage and diversion that's been ongoing. But certainly we'll keep the council apprised as we are able to identify additional winter overtime capacity. Hopefully also some of the permanent housing, the Brighton Marine veterans housing just opened. That's got a priority for units for formerly homeless veterans. So we're in touch with all the parties, and certainly no one's more concerned than the city agencies working on homelessness that we have enough capacity for everyone to get in this winter. There's additional planning, of course, that's going to happen if there is, as predicted, a COVID surge in the winter months.
No doubt. I really do appreciate your work and your group's focus, especially on our most vulnerable residents, especially as we think about the colder months ahead. One quick question about the ESG funding. I know that there's always concerns around clarity on appropriate use, and appropriate use has shifted as additional funds have become available, especially during this time. Have we seen any sort of new and creative ways in which to access that funds, also being mindful that you know, when we do our report and when we eventually sort of participate in some sort of audit, that we've used those funds appropriately? I don't know who that question might be for, maybe Tim or Kate.
You're on mute, Tim.
Tim, you're on.
I'm trying to get off mute. I think the important thing for us on the CV funds is that we have to be tying it back to responding to COVID. So we do have to be very mindful of that in our tracking of any expenses and or uses. And so that's important for our compliance staff, which Rick oversees them directly, but that's an important thing for us to take note of.
Yeah, I think the other, Rick Wilson here. I think the other thing is Chief Dillon was also really intentional with this, particularly the second round of funding, that we wanted this to be really looking to, not just add kind of not just temporarily respond to the crisis, but actually get us set up to be in a better position once the pandemic is over, which, there's no end in sight right now, but which is why we're focusing so much of the funding on rapid rehousing and not just adding, temporary winter beds, even though that is one of the priorities. So, I think again, we're trying to just get ourselves and put in a better position going forward, and not just have a kind of knee-jerk reaction. Let's do, quick fixes with the funding. So I think we're well positioned. I'm not worried about us, running into any problems with how we're using the ESG funding. We're looking at, all of our funding sources. We always try to make sure that we're lining up the needs and the uses with the most appropriate funding source. Some of them have different deadlines. Some of them have different, eligibility criteria. So we want to make sure that we're using all of them appropriately. And I'll just say quickly on that, we haven't talked about, homelessness prevention, but that's, the ESG funding, we're focusing on homelessness, and then it's the CDBG funding, CARES Act funding that we're kind of targeting at homelessness prevention and rent relief.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all.
Councillor Mejia?
Yes, thank you for inviting me, the chair and the sponsors. I just have a few questions. I'm just curious, is this funding solely going to housing? Because I'm also thinking about food access and other short-term services that our unhoused populations face. And I'm just curious as to whether or not there's an opportunity for that. I'm also curious, I know that Councillor Bach asked the question in terms of engaging community, nonprofit partners. So I'm glad that that was addressed, but I do want to add another layer to that. And I'm just curious, we hear from a lot of folks who are unhoused, who don't have access to the internet, who don't have access to mobile phones or smartphones, or they're not even connected to nonprofit organizations. So, I've been hearing from folks about the level of engagement for that population. And I'm just curious about how we're tapping into those who are in greatest need, but have absolutely no way of connecting. And I'm just curious about how are we connecting with individuals and families experiencing homelessness, either directly or through advocacy groups to survey their needs, like what that level of engagement looks like. And as always, I'm going to ask about language access, because a public hearing or a conversation without me asking the question about are things in multiple languages, I'm just curious about that level of engagement. So those are just the few things that I have. And thank you, Chairwoman Councillor Edwards, for hosting.
Okay, I think I can start with the food access question. So the funding that we put out, it's Emergency Solutions Grant funding through HUD. And so there are eligible activities sort of within the broad buckets that I talked about. Food access is, in terms of eligibility, food is an eligible expense for people that are in shelter. What gets tricky is that when you try to look at food access to sort of the general community or people that are in housing but are experiencing food insecurity, food is not an eligible expense for ESG. So what we've been doing in instances like that and earlier in the pandemic is we've been working closely with resources like the Boston Resiliency Fund to make sure that family shelters or individual shelters that were working with people that were newly housed, that were experiencing food access issues, had a way to make sure that those needs were met. And then Jim, I don't know if you want to talk about the engagement question on outreach for people that don't have access to tech.
Sure. Counselor, thank you for that important question. So a couple of things. There are in the housing push, which we haven't talked about, but the city's identified 135 units for homeless adults and individuals. I know Councilor Sabi Georgia knows there are many more than that with vouchers for families that are trying to be placed out of the system. But there are representatives from the consumer advocacy boards that have been engaged with us at the city on in that initiative. They have access, and for example, there are people connected to the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless, Consumer Advisory Board, et cetera. There have continued to be at times, I think, town meetings in some of the shelters. And then our outreach programs, the Public Health Commission's Engagement Center, the additional outreach workers that cover the Mass Ave Melnia Cast area, certainly the Pine Street outreach teams, victory programs, everyone is in constant kind of engagement and assessment with constituents, really directly, conversationally about addressing their needs. And then they try to kind of problem solve and workshop those across the programs that have access. So I think but those are important considerations, and trying to make sure that information is made available to people and communicated to them directly is really critically important. I think that the language access issue is certainly something we're mindful of. We've asked Pine Street Inn to prioritize in expanding their street outreach to hire staff who are both culturally competent and bilingual whenever possible. That's really critically important. So, I think that there's, multilingual capacity at the person-to-person level among most of our providers. But the points are really well taken, that we want to be sure we get information out to people in a way that's most accessible and available to them.
Thank you for that, Jim. I just want to quickly follow up on something in regards to those who are undocumented. Just wanted to know what special efforts are being made. I know that there are a lot of folks right now who are worried about what's coming down the pipeline. Many haven't been unable to work. And I'm just curious what efforts, if any, are being made specifically to help support our undocumented residents.
Sure. Well,
go ahead, Katie, you first. Yeah.
Nope. What I was going to say is just from sort of an eligibility perspective, one thing that is really good about COC resources, it's one of the few federal sources where undocumented status does not make you ineligible to access those resources. So we are very mindful of that, and we really appreciate the fact that we have the resources that we do have to serve this population, because I think more than most populations, this is a particularly scary time, both from a health perspective and an economic peril perspective. And so we do have resources in the portfolio that can go to support members of that community.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. And one last thing, I just want to say that Tim and Jim, you guys kind of look alike. And it's kind of weird looking at the situation on my screen, but that's all I have, Councilor Edwards, and I won't be able to stay on past 11. I have another commitment, but I'm very happy to stay on until then and continue to listen and learn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just had some follow-up questions. I just want to make, with regard to the $23 million, is any of it going to for OHS, is it any of it funneling to the OHS's rental assistance program, specifically targeted for homeless folks, or is that completely different funding?
That's different funding, Councilor. So that's what the way we've kind of divided it up. ESG is around homelessness. The CDBG is what we're kind of targeting, and that we have $20 million in CDBG that we're kind of reserving, and have committed $5 million of that already to rent relief.
Okay, and then how is it? I mean, we push this one because we completely support you, D&D, and wanting to make sure you have the resources, all that you have and need right away. But how is this hopefully marrying or hopefully responding to or helping prepare us for when the moratorium is up? can you talk to me about how some of these services, by them being enhanced, is going to help some more people, or is that really just with OHS's response? Is this not really helping those folks?
Yeah, I think so. I can say that yeah, again, the ESG funding, we're not targeting for those purposes. Some of that activity would be eligible, and we're not kind of prohibiting entities from submitting applications for that funding, but it's not the priority for this funding. The CDBG funding is where the CDBG CV funding is where we are we're targeting that funding at both the rent relief fund, and you also have heard about enhanced the housing court navigator and as well as legal assistance, outreach. The city council and the mayor provided additional funding in this year's budget for housing stability initiatives, including greater outreach mailings in multiple languages around tenant rights, particularly right now. I think people are confused and concerned about what the moratorium means and what it means when it ends. So actually that's in the works right now. A large mailing should be going out, or maybe it has gone out. I'm not sure, but yeah, that's it's not part of the funding that's before you today.
Okay. And then I'm curious about the tax. I don't know if you recall a couple years ago when we did the Airbnb ordinance, there was a certain, I think, certain percent could stay with the city, certain percent went to the state, and the city decided that that percentage of funding would go to homelessness prevention. If you don't have it now, I would eventually like to get an update on if there's been any funding. I know Airbnb has been dead for the most part this year, but I'm hopeful that that expanded hotel tax category for homelessness, I would love to hear how that has helped or hurt or anything. And then my final question is for Jim. Are we going to have a homeless census this year, or what?
So, Counselor, that's actually unclear. And certainly if we do have one, we cannot conduct it in the ways that we have in the past. There's no way we could gather, 350 to 400 people at City Hall and fan out. I think there's been a lot of advocacy. Katie's aware of this with HUD. Many communities do the street count every other year. We've done one, as you know, annually for 40 years. I've done most of them, which is why, for Councilor Mejia's point, why Tim should be flattered that we look alike. I've gone old and gray doing the homeless census. But whatever we do for this winter, we are certainly going to be tracking the populations that are unhoused and engaging them with the Public Health Commission, with Pine Street, and with our other providers. So, I think the national advocacy trend, Katie, maybe you can weigh in, is recommending that this potentially be an off year, particularly if there's a winter COVID surge.
Yeah, you're right, Jim. I mean, and that's what I have heard. They haven't made a final determination on whether or not unsheltered counts will be required this year. But as you said, many communities do it biannually. So we've certainly met the requirement in terms of having done our count earlier this year. I do expect that they will hold on to the requirement of a sheltered count, which is separate from the big event at City Hall, but important nonetheless. So there'll be a count of some sort, but I don't know that, as Jim said, it will look very differently if it happens at all on the unsheltered side.
Well, I can speak for myself. I'm sure for my other colleagues that are at large and district counselors, that if you need any help in designing a mini district-based program that either assists or feeds in and isn't as expansive, I would love to be part of that and helping to recruit volunteers for just East Boston, recruit volunteers in Charlestown and in the North End. That I would love to be a part of it. I look forward to it. I've started, when I heard about it when I was at D&D, and then just kind of fell in love with it and really I think it's not just about the count. It's about the awareness that it brings. I remember the coldest night of the year, it was like -7. Mm-hmm. And that's when I found more homeless people than I ever did in the other 2 years that I'd done it. And so it brings people to see face to face what we're dealing with. And I really hope that there's a way in which Boston can design a program that still brings us face to face with our most vulnerable constituents. And I think I really appreciate your leadership in that. I'm hopeful we can come up with a way.
I appreciate that, Councilor Edwards. And, you know, whether HUD requires it or not, we certainly would be happy to work with the council and our other provider partners, because I agree with you. It's a moment of, you know, hard work at an unusual hour, but also heightened awareness of a city responding to our most vulnerable neighbors in need. So please do keep in touch. Councilor, could I just add, Councilor Bach, to your question about the community meal sites, I did want to mention, which I forgot to, that we've been very engaged with the Women's Lunch Place, which, as you know, had to kind of convert to meals to go and healthy meals. They've maintained their advocacy operations, but we have been working with them to try to look at possibilities and options this winter, including some conversations with the faith community downtown. But I forgot to mention them earlier, but we've been in touch with their leadership team and continue to try to crack the nut of places to help more vulnerable women access services indoors. So we'll certainly keep in touch as things emerge.
Councilor, if you do on the room occupancy tax, that was the ordinance that changed around. It wasn't, you know, sort of technically tied to Airbnb, but that's kind of what precipitated the change. And I'm glad to say that both in FY20 and FY21, D&D's budget did include additional funding. I think it was $5 million in FY20 and $4 million in FY21. That was, you know, it's not sort of directly tied, I guess, to that funding, but that was the, you know, kind of where it came from. And it was despite the kind of impacts on the hotel and lodging industry because of COVID. We were very happy that that funding was prioritized and was not, you know, was maintained in our budget. And for the funding that we've received so far, most of it has been allocated to permanent supportive housing, specifically the Pine Street Inn project on Washington Street in JP, which is, you know, just a huge project. And hopefully that can move forward. And we were happy to get that funding and be able to use it for that purpose.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, that update. To my colleagues, unless there are any further questions, I'm going to go ahead and turn it to the administration. Do you have any concluding remarks?
No, we don't have any concluding remarks. Just we want to thank you for your time and your interest in this topic, and hopefully for your support on the upcoming vote. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I believe, and I'll check with Neil, I think it was coming up in matters for this week.
I believe it is. I believe it is. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, so my intention is to report it out and favorably and ask for my colleagues to vote and support this funding. So,
thank you.
So with that, unless there's any more remarks, I clap out as I end the hearing.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
All right.
Kyle, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.